You're listening to the 2018 Nelson Arts Festival Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers Program. This session features Naomi Arnold, Danyl Mclaughlan, Chloe Swarbrick in conversation with Liz Price. Good afternoon and welcome to Mind Matters. I'm so delighted to see so many people here. Thank you all very much for coming. My name's Kerry Sunderland and I'm the Readers and Writers Coordinator. All I need to do is really thank our wonderful sponsor, Page and Blackmore, and I'm going to hand over now to our very capable chair, Liz Price. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. Kerry should be on stage too because she has a chapter in this book, Headlands, as does Sarah Wilson, who I think is in our audience as well. So thank you both for being here. The little yellow cards aren't for you, aren't reserved seats. They're just a little thing from me from the Polytech. Thank you to the Polytech for their photocopying. Because I think at a cellular level, if we could feel that we mattered, it would make a difference. So what I'd love you to do is put it in a library book, or put it on your mirror, or put it next to a photo of someone you love, or someone you're having difficulty with, and just look at it. So I'm Liz Price. I teach on the counselling program at the Polytech, and I'm really looking forward to this lovely exchange with these three fine people. I'm just going to do a brief introduction. Naomi Arnold, over here, has a string of awards to her name. Loves writing, and her favourite magazine to write in is New Zealand Geographic. In 2014, Naomi went freelance, and her awards include 2015 Regional and Community Newspaper Feature Writer of the Year, and in 2018 Science and Technology Award finalist at the Voyager Media Awards. Naomi and her husband have both experienced crisis point anxiety, so she clearly has a very personal knowledge of the book she has edited. She loves the outdoors and tries to incorporate it in her daily life through cycling, tramping and walking her beloved dog Dusty on the back beach. She also came up with the idea for this book while she was cycling to the pub one afternoon, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. She's just edited Headlands, News Stories of Anxiety, and her next book on New Zealand astronomy is due out next year. She's not idle, is Naomi, so there's Naomi. Danyl Mclaughlan has a chapter in the book. He was born in Wellington in '74, studied at Victoria University and travelled and worked in Europe, Asia and the Middle East before returning to Wellington. He works as a biologist and is the author of the comic noir novels Unspeakable Secrets of the Aro Valley, 2013, and Mysterious Mysteries of the Aro Valley, 2016. Danyl reads a lot, and he's a middle-aged dad of a 7-year-old daughter. Danyl. Chloe Swarbrick grew up in an Auckland family who raised her on a diet of robust and challenging discussions, which probably stands you in good stead now, and in a community that showed her that inequality and injustices were a daily reality for far too many New Zealanders. She's been a law student, journalist, business owner, and a community project leader. When interviewing politicians of all colours on daily issues, she too often found that they had become out of sync with the orbit of everyday people's lives. She couldn't see herself, her friends or her whānau in politics. So in 2016, Chloe did what any reasonable, disillusioned 22-year-old would do. She ran to be Mayor of Auckland. Standing against Phil Goff, previous leader of the Labour Party and the city's new mayor, Phil Goff was challenging, yet almost 30,000 Aucklanders gave her their vote. This gave her the confidence to stand as a candidate for the party whose values matched hers, and she was elected as a Green Party MP into Parliament in 2017 as list MP for Auckland Central. She's the youngest MP in Aotearoa for over 40 years. She entered Parliament to show people that politicians can look a little different, sound a little different, do things a little different, and to drive home the message that politicians work for people. Chloe is now Green Party spokesperson for education, internal affairs, sensible drug law reform, local government, arts, culture and heritage, broadcasting and youth, and mental health. Another person who's not idle. So, mostly I want to concentrate on talking about the book, Headlands, but there's a little bit I just want to talk about mental health reviews and how we could maybe do things a little bit differently in New Zealand. So I just want to talk about the People's Mental Health Review. 500 crowdsourced stories, 5 key recommendations. Increased funding for mental health, provide wider range of treatment options, treat clients with respect, involve families more, and conduct a national inquiry. And I've added that I'd really like everybody, every teacher in New Zealand to teach their students mindfulness. In January, Jacinda Ardern announced a ministerial inquiry into mental health and addiction. With its first budget, the government has put in place an extended nurses in schools program, cheaper GP visits, pilot program giving those 18 to 25 free mental health counselling, and any additional mental health funding has been deferred until the ministerial inquiry reports back. 170,000 people accessed mental health and addiction services in the last year. So I just wanted to address this, mainly with Chloe. How's it going, that mental health review?
So I think a really important thing to note about that inquiry is that it's independent. So there was a body that was established which exists outside of any ministry or any politician. So it's a broad range of New Zealanders who are coming together to conduct it. The most recent news that we have is that as a result of the huge swathes of evidence research and submissions that they received, is that they've asked, that group has asked for an extension for the report back. So unfortunately, it was due to be reported back at the end of October, but now it'll be reported back about 4 weeks after that. But the good thing about it being an independent report is obviously there is no government or political intervention in it or what comes out as a result of it. What I've kind of been trying to do in my position as our mental health spokesperson in Confidence and Supply. Confidence and Supply kind of gives us the flexibility to obviously support the government but also constructively critique it, is try to bring together a cross-party group on drug harm reduction but also now trying to integrate mental health as well, recognising that, of course, the fundamental drivers for abuse and addiction, as well as a whole raft of mental health issues, are kind of escapism or isolation, those kinds of things. What's really encouraging about the government terms of reference that we created for the mental health and addiction inquiry is that it's the first time that a government-led project into mental health has recognised environmental factors in contributing to mental health issues. So it moves away from this kind of pathologising, medicalising model. Really excited about that being tabled because that will exist independently and provide accountability to the government having to actually make those things happen. It's looking good. It's looking good.
Okay. What do you two think about the People's Mental Health Review, the recommendations? Increased funding, provide wider range of treatment options, treat clients with respect, involve families more, and conduct a national inquiry. What do you guys, have you got any thoughts about that? Anything you want to...
sounds great. I mean, how's it going to work in practice? What does respect for someone mean? You know, and where does that start and when does that finish? We do have an essay in the book by Paula Harris which talks about, she went to see a new psychiatrist. Yeah. And he committed her to the inpatient ward because she had suicide plans and she wouldn't tell him what they were. And she says that actually sparked her most severe episode of anxiety. So when is respect caring for a patient and being concerned about their life, and when is it letting them, walk out that door trusting they won't
It's a wonderful essay, isn't it? She calls him Voldemort.
Yeah.
Which
she gets trauma over his name. It's a big trigger for her.
Which is really good.
But more funding, more treatment options, a wide range of therapies as well. I mean, we have, you go to the doctor and you get given Celebram or Prozac and then sent on your way you're quite isolated, and then the family has to cope. So, yeah, there's a lot there.
Danyl, have you got any?
I think one of the things who can disagree with that, but I think it is also useful to remember that there is sort of at the moment a ceiling to what can be really delivered through mental health and improved mental health care. The actual nature of the diseases are still incredibly vague. The clinical diagnostics are incredibly vague. The treatments obviously have to be a form of personalised medicine, but nobody really knows how to do that. So at the moment it consists of doctors or psychologists kind of guessing, maybe you should go on this medication because I've had luck with that in the past, and maybe that will work for you, or maybe it won't, or maybe you should have supportive therapy or cognitive behavioural therapy, and maybe that will work and maybe that won't. And so yeah, there are at the moment still basically practical limits as to how effective it can be. And that is, when you talk to some of the off the record, that's why off the record, some of the advisors in the health space who are talking about funding is that they question as to whether this is an effective way to spend taxpayer dollars on diseases and forms of treatment that are incredibly vague and don't really work and are very expensive, and we could be spending that on grommets or hip replacements. Yeah.
We've recently been lucky enough to be in Scandinavia, and in a park that's also a cemetery, we met this lovely guy and his partner and their new baby, and got talking. We wanted to know the way to Hans Christian Andersen's grave, and he said he designs chess videos to encourage more Danes to play chess. And he said, "What do I do?" And I said, "I'm a counsellor." And he said, "I have schizophrenia." And I said, "Mate, you seem to be managing that really well." And he said, "I really am. I've had amazing psychotherapy regularly, weekly, for the last 10 years from the Danish health system." And I think that's the kind of thing that would be really lovely. And then he started singing Flight of the Conchord songs because he loves Flight of the Conchord. I love people that great. That's great. So that was wonderful. So I'm going to get Danyl to read a little bit from his chapter in the book. So
okay, so just
maybe anything else.
So just so that this makes a little bit of sense, I'll give you a little bit of background. So I didn't really have much luck with the insomnia medication that I went on. I didn't want to be taking it, so I started to try doing meditation, and I had various unsuccessful attempts to doing that, and ending up in kind of strange new age meetings and listening to people talk about quantum crystal healing. So I found this book about secular meditation, which is a non-mystical way to go about it. It's sort of like a very practical, pragmatic way to incorporate meditation into your life. And so the passage that Mrs. Mark says, the book employs an old Buddhist metaphor. So if you ever try to meditate, the first thing you find is that you can't do it. It's whenever there's an article on the internet, it always shows these people who look incredibly serene and they're smiling and they're really beautiful, but it's extremely difficult, frustrating, irritating thing to do on a daily basis. And so it's just sort of a shame that it's also, that such an annoying thing is also very effective. But so you find that you can't do it. And the book employs an old Buddhist metaphor. The mind is like a baby elephant. If you tether it to the ground, it will run around and strain at the leash, and then it will fall asleep. There are more tips and exercises to counter this sleepiness, which the book refers to as strong dullness. After strong dullness, you run into physical discomforts, pain in your knees, your back, itches in your face, more exercises. Then once you've overcome mind-wandering, physical discomfort, and strong dullness, you have to contend with subtle dullness, the awake but still not alert condition in which we spend most of our lives. There are yet more exercises for this, and they, like all the other exercises, are very boring. I wouldn't bother with any of them for even a week, let alone the month I'd been performing them, if they didn't have the baffling but overwhelming side effects of making me feel more focused, less anxious, peaceful, and calm. So, thank you. Yeah.
So how's it going?
It's going really well, and I was actually thinking today that it's something that I do feel kind of grateful that I ended up having these anxious insomniac traditions, because it has brought this, because I would never have done any of this if it wasn't an effective form of treatment for a mental health problem. So it's a very, interesting, useful part of my life now, and it's going great. It's still a thing.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Do you two meditate?
No, I have had times when I have, but I pretty much think, I don't have time for that, and then I'll go on to the next, just move on to the next task for the day. But it actually, I have had some pretty incredible experiences just sitting and being still, and I mean, lots of different ways to be mindful or to meditate, but it was like some quite powerful religious type experiences. I'm not really a spiritual or religious person, but that was probably where I've got closest to understanding what that's like.
The book makes it very clear that that's a bad thing, because that's, and this is a very common thing when you start to meditate, and again, I've had this, your brain starts to think you're falling to go to sleep, so it tips you into REM sleep, and you start having mystical experiences. Instead, your brain is supposed to be more alert even than it is in the waking light.
So
and again, because everyone does that, everyone has that.
So I haven't gone very far on the journey.
No.
But Danyl's essay does actually traverse all those different. It's an amazing piece. It's something you do.
I did try kind of at the height of anxiety as a teenager to get into meditation in a big way, and found it somewhat successful. And it's always been this countervailing thing where I've been trying to do it to manage stress and all the rest, but same, finding time to be less stressed is very difficult. So what I've actually ended up doing is attempting to find space to exercise, because I think what you end up doing when you become incredibly busy is sleep, diet and exercise all fall off, and the order usually of exercise is first to go, and then diet and then sleep. For me it's been this process of trying to find time to exercise, and that very much feels like meditation. I really enjoy this, I hope this is not seen as offensive, but the dumbness of kind of lifting stuff up and putting it down. So weightlifting is a good kind of meditative thing for me.
Gravity.
Yeah.
Simple as it gets.
Exactly. And you put your phone in your locker and you don't have to deal with it. Yeah.
I teach my students about it, but I'm actually crap at doing it myself. So, we're all on the journey.
I mean, it's only 10 minutes. You can have amazing benefits.
That's
right.
All for it.
That's right. I know.
I even signed up to an app.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love your bit, which you recommend that particular book. So I'll track that down, Danyl, because it sounds like
probably in the library.
Yeah, really good book for actual practical.
Yes.
Yeah, doing it. Good on you. So now we're just going to talk about people in the book, and Michelle Langston, who's an actor and a writer, described hot anxietiness and tight palpitations, and she found solace at a bird sanctuary. At the end of her essay, she wrote, "I don't think the why of anxiety matters to me anymore. I know that it comes when I feel I can't communicate or I am not understood. So I try to speak bravely. I say how I feel and I ask for what I need. And then I look outwards to see if there is anyone else I can help." Isn't that wonderful? I just thought that was just amazing. And there was an article in North and South, I think, about her chapter.
Also, the Australian Women's Weekly.
Oh, well, there you go.
The
Right,
current
we're
Australian
going further afield.
Big time.
Just across the Tasman.
What I loved about this book is the bravery and the courage of all the people who wrote in it. And just the variety of people that you chose, and also the variety of the stories. And the fact she went to that bird sanctuary, I thought was amazing, really quite wonderful.
Yeah, hers is gorgeous. I really, she was one of the people who identified that withdrawal of love can be quite a major driver of anxiety, whether you perceive that in terms of loss of respect or status or love or attention, or whether it's quite blatant. And is it right if I read?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I've underlined this lavishly, but she has a really nice passage about how she's always felt this, she calls it a fever, even as a child. So she says, "Once I took all my clothes off in a bathroom stall and lay down on the cool tiles just to try to put the fire out. I rested my face on my folded blue jeans because inside the furnace I still had the presence of mind to consider germs, even if this was my demise, death by nerves on a cold toilet floor, burning alive in the middle of winter at a restaurant in Mount Eden. When I was small, I had a grave fear of being misunderstood. I remember writing cards to my parents and drawing hearts all over the cardboard, telling them how much I loved them, dozens of cards, just in case they forgot. After my father was diagnosed with cancer, we cleared the house of years of clutter, and I found manila folders full of my school things in the cupboard, reports and notebooks and art. Tucked among them were the cards I'd made for my mother and father. One of them apologised profusely for doing things wrong and reiterated my love over and over, every alphabet letter a different felt tip pen colour. I felt sad when I saw that card. Sad that someone so small should be worried already, anxious that love might run out. Yeah.
I know, and it's a really good example of how early anxiety can start and how, it builds and sort of latches on and keeps on going and things. And, mental health services are hard to access. Alan Drew's wife was such a wise presence for him because he had great difficulty accessing it. And she just, I think they came up with a numbers system, didn't they?
Yeah, they had a 1 to 10 scale.
1 to 10.
And she'd say, what number are you at? And he'd say, I'm a 10 right now. She'd be like, okay.
Which meant he was really good.
He was really, and then, he spoke about his daughter and how his came on when his daughter arrived, into the world, and he suddenly felt, an intense sense of what that means. And responsibility, Which, what was that like for you when you had your child? Did that manifest for you?
Well, it was hard to sort of think back through the sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
So I probably didn't have the energy to be anxious or feel literally anything else other than exhausted.
Yeah. But yeah, a big change like that can be, a tipping point.
Well, and I think triggers him probably back into some stuff that from his past, from when he was a little person. Yeah. Ricky Gooch, Maori musician. He says, learn to dance with anxiety rather than drum it out. Mm-hmm. How cool's that?
Yeah, he had a great...
He's got a wellness plan, which I thought was wonderful.
Yes.
Anyway, talk.
Oh, no, you...
No, please.
Oh, okay. Am I reading something?
Yeah, if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ricky, we interviewed Ricky. He wasn't keen to write a piece himself, but we a few people in here have been interviewed because they didn't sort of feel able to put it into words, so that was a good way to get over the barrier.
Oh, okay. I hadn't had a sense of that, so that's, good.
But he says, I think he had a really important point to make about, class and cultural differences. Māori adults are 1.5 times as likely as non-Māori adults to report a very high probability of anxiety, depressive disorder, and then there's the access to the care. So he says, I guess it's almost a class thing that I've had more opportunities. Through music, I've had the privilege of access to networks. For example, the doctor and poet Glenn Colquhoun was the first person to recognise there was something wrong with me. We were doing an arts project together, and if not for meeting him and talking to him through that, I wouldn't have spoken to a doctor. And through my doctor, I wouldn't have met my psychologist. If I'd just been living in South Dunedin, struggling with all this stuff, I'd probably be in prison or hospital or dead. So he accessed that level that managed to get him
the help he needed.
And how many people end up in prison instead. Can I read this other part?
Please.
Okay.
Yep.
Just indulge me. He also has a great passage here where he talks about Māori mental health and how colonisation has impacted negatively on that. So he says, I think historical trauma has been passed down through DNA, through culture, through colonisation and its effects. With any colonial movement, there is huge displacement, not just of land and people, but of identity and spirit. It gets passed down through generations. Māori would call it a makutu, which is a curse that carries on until it is broken. I think there's been a devastating effect on Māori through losing connection with the land and with whakapapa, connection with simplicity and with your spiritual realm, with how you fit in, your tūranga waiwai. Losing those connections means you are walking in between worlds, which translates to mental health issues. Quite often these are spiritual issues.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you got him in the book. It's fantastic. So let's go back to you biking to the pub, the free house.
Yep.
One afternoon.
Friday,
Friday afternoon, as a lot of us do, or some of us don't bike, but anyway, and you had this idea. So can you just talk us through how the book came about? Because it's such a significant book, actually, Naomi.
Well, I just realised how many writers I knew who had anxiety. Sort of a dozen popped into my head, and I stopped and emailed them all on my phone and said, hey, if I was to pitch a book of essays on anxiety, would you guys be keen to contribute? And the replies just started pouring in within minutes. It was just, yes, capital letters, exclamation mark.
Ashley Young.
Yes. And there was about 5 of them. I was like, oh, okay, I guess I have to do it now. so Jess Mclaughlan said, Naomi, is this a 5 p.m. pub idea? And I said, yes, it is. But she said yes, and that was 18 months ago. It was March, the year before last. And then Ashley suggested I pitched Fergus at VUP, Fergus Barrowman, and he was like, yep, sounds great. So I was like, oh, okay, I guess it's on. So then, yeah, I think I had about 21 people, and then we went to VUP, and then they were really amazing coming up with people who I didn't know had anxiety, and we managed to, flesh out to sort of 32 writers in the end. And it was really interesting just approaching people, because some you knew had it because they'd written about it, or you just knew them personally, and then other people you sort of suspected they might, but you can't say, hey,
That's an awkward conversation, isn't it? We really want you for this book about mental health.
Yeah.
We think it's so appropriate that you'd be in there. This book about very disturbed people with serious, serious problems. You have to be in it.
So I ended up...
Is that how it came across to you, Danyl?
Actually, I've got a good story about that. Ashley and I were talking to each other at a party about audible hallucinations, which is how my piece starts. And so anyway, about 3 months later, I just started writing about this, and I didn't have any place where I was going to put it. And then about 3 months later, I ran into her, and I knew she was working on headlands, yeah. And I said, how's it going? And she said, well, all our contributors suffer from chronic anxiety, so we're kind of missing our deadlines, and it's possible we haven't thought this project through very well. And so I said, okay, well, I have something that's written, and you can just have it.
So yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
so,
and then she turned up with it, because Ashley Young, Kirsten McDougall, Holly Hunter, and Samantha Chorley, who was an intern at VUP, were really amazing in doing a lot of the copy editing and a lot of the communication. So we had this team of five or six people who were sort of all focused on these writers, and come on guys, let's get this done. And we sort of had to jolly a lot along. So having a finished piece, Kirsten put it down in front of me. I was just like, this is exactly what we want. This is brilliant. I was like, oh, so we called them.
Thank you, Danyl. Good on you.
Yeah, it was one of our big pillar pieces, we call them. Did I have a point I was originally making?
Just about how the book came about.
Oh,
and
trying to get hold of people. That's right. So I emailed about 100 people, and just said, so if you know someone who has anxiety and might want to contribute to this book, let me know, because I think you probably do. And then put out a big Twitter call, and we got about 74 people saying they wanted to contribute. And then actually I think we only got about 4 or 5 came through from that. People just sort of fell away. So yeah, eventually. Yeah, and also just opening up like that.
May I ask? Sorry, I was just, I haven't read the book yet, sorry. But I'm fascinated, and I recently, in the last parliamentary recess, did hui all around the country at universities talking to students about mental health. And something which came through across the entire country is this dichotomy whereby people don't feel as though we talk about the reality of mental health enough, but they also feel as though when we do talk about mental health that it is quite romanticised. And I think particularly in the creative space it is. And we often kind of forgive some quite bad behaviour from certain artists as a result of their creations. And I was just wondering, how did you grapple with that? Did you have to grapple with that?
Ricky actually talks about some of his past bad behaviour and how he can look back now and see what was driving it, and he talks about his substance, alcohol and drugs.
Yeah.
He has Trinity roots, so he was obviously involved, quite high level in New Zealand music. What was the original question?
It was just kind of thorough, like how do we deal with the raising awareness about mental health whilst not romanticising it?
The thing was just to get them just to write what they wanted, really. I didn't have any prescription. It was just, we want to explore. I think I said we want to explore anxiety inside and outside your head, like how it is for you and how it relates to you in the world and the people around you, family, friends. And so there wasn't really any direction. Like everyone came back with incredibly different pieces. There were about 20 that we had to sadly say goodbye to because they didn't fit the book, which actually started developing its own presence in a way. So some of them repeated what was already in there, or it was like another Pākehā woman in her 30s, and we just felt we had too many of them, and so we kind of took the best we could. But Yeah, I think they're just so honest. They're
Yeah.
just so
It's a
powerful.
very authentic book, and it's not romantic.
Yeah, no,
No,
totally.
no,
I mean,
yeah,
because
yeah.
that's the thing that fascinates me, right, is that we have to find a way to, like I spoke about mental health and my own personal history with regard to mental health, particularly anxiety and depression, in my maiden speech in Parliament. And I spoke about how I don't think that makes me special. I feel as though it makes me normal because it's so pervasive in society. But it's how do we draw this line where obviously it's okay for people to be experiencing mental ill health, but also we should all not be okay with the fact that
It's
we're not
almost
doing
like you're
well.
talking about something incredibly relevant to contemporary politics there.
In what, sorry?
Well, like, where's the line between somebody who's acting in an extremely unethical way
Yeah.
and someone who has serious mental health problems?
Yeah.
That's
But,
reminiscent.
yeah. But I like the term for that is yeah,
Topical.
Yeah. So, but I think you've touched on a really important point, which is self-licensing, which is sometimes when people get a diagnosis of a mental health problem, they feel like it licenses them to behave badly.
Yeah.
I can do this because I suffer from depression, so I can treat my family really badly, or I can, and I think it's an incredibly, it can be a very harmful thing. And
Totally.
yeah,
And I
so-
think that raises questions around support people in particular as well, because that's something which came up around the country, is people saying, I don't know when I'm supposed to take a step back from supporting somebody if they're becoming abusive or whatever.
And how to protect themselves as well.
Yeah, because it has ripple effects.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about continuing with you in terms of how you chose particular stories, and who. I mean, because what I love about the book is the diversity of stories and the diversity of cultures, and I also became much more aware of the need we have, if we have a friend with anxiety, to just be with them and not try and solve it. Not suggest they take up a different diet or exercise, just be alongside them. And sometimes that's quite difficult. I mean, and Hinimoa Baker talks about that very eloquently, I think, about how she said she sees herself as a terrible friend, which I thought was very
does.
sad, actually.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
You guys into readings?
Yeah.
Not all politics and politics. So she says, social situations are another thing my anxiety latches onto. People are often surprised to hear this because I'm a performer and a teacher, and I seem very confident doing those and many other things. I tell them I'm good at camouflage. It's survival. One of my closest friends often says to me, I've known you for nearly 15 years and I still can't tell when you're having a hard time unless you outright say so. Another dear friend of mine throws an annual summer party and she invites me every time. Some years I feel strong enough to drive there, park and turn the car key to off. Some years I'm then able to open the door of the car and walk into the house. Just half an hour, I say to myself, just half an hour. Several times I've simply driven home, hating myself, adding another instrument to the You're a Terrible Friend orchestra playing in my head.
Isn't that sad? I mean, and yet it's so insightful as to how she has to manage her life with the illness. Yeah.
And, good friends will know that and they won't judge you.
No,
You
that's
can't
right.
go
That's
inside.
right. Yeah. Just getting back to you for a minute, I love the title of yours, Arise and Pass Away. I thought that was a really lovely title for Danyl's essay. And you seem to have a very supportive, wise wife.
I do. Most of the time when I sort of seem to say or write something unusually insightful, it's just plagiarism, and kind of I'm repeating something that she has said. So, yeah,
Oh, okay.
That's one of my greatest strengths. Yeah, but yeah, Arise and Pass Away is part of the one of the core tenets of Buddhism, which is not like a faith I know very much about at all, and there's this argument that it's not even a faith, it's a philosophy, that all of our thoughts and actually all of existence is completely impermanent. It's simply rising and then passing away.
You talk about the dark night of the soul, which is part of the book
Yes.
that you refer to, and one of my favourite saints, ex-Catholic, is John of the Cross. And John of the Cross had this wonderful saying, to come from all to all, we must leave all for all, and when we come to have all, we must have it without wanting anything. And when I read your chapter, that just reminded me of that. Yeah, so it's quite lovely. Yeah. So, Kate Kennedy, I loved her chapter, and she was talking about the constant I'm a failure, the tape she had in her head all the time. And I love this bit. I had unmasked these malevolent malfunctions. Isn't that great? For the total frauds that they really were. Knowledge gave me the power to decide to do things differently, to start speaking to myself with kindness and care, to try to look at day-to-day events as opportunities for growth and change, and maybe even through which to find happiness. I had to deprogram my fear response and replace it with a baby steps version of faith. Great
Yeah.
writing too. I love that. Malevolent malfunctions. I think that's such a good description of what she's been going through.
Yeah, Kate's a Motueka
Yeah.
originally. She's not here, is she? She was going to come over from Blenheim, but I don't think she could make it. But she released a book a few years ago called Matters to a Head, and it was on cannabis addiction and recovery. It's a great book. I was working at Nelson Mail at that time. I was a health reporter, and I interviewed her for it and met her and was just struck by her amazing presence. Her eyes, you could tell she'd been through hell and back, but she was just a really generous, she had so much knowledge and wisdom that she'd gained on that journey. And yes, I asked her to write about the cannabis, and we're at an interesting time with cannabis at the moment, but for young people it can do very bad things to your brain, and for some people it can break their brain, which is how she describes it. So I might just read the last little, she's just got a sentence in here that I thought was really good. Well, it's all really good, but so she's been clean and sober for over 17 years now, and I'm grateful for every single day of triumph over self-destruction that I've found through the 12 steps. The tyranny of fear that consumed me seems like a surreal, long-ago nightmare, leaving a healed-over scar that reminds me daily how great it is to be free. I couldn't do it alone, though. To recover myself, I had to find other people who knew how to get there, and I recommend that you do too. And the book was hoping to be the other people, you can read this and see yourself in a lot of pages, I think. So that was kind of its aim.
Tell us about your story, your and your husband's story, because there was a bit that I read, I think in the North and South, about that terrible GP.
Yeah.
Oi, 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 oi.
Yeah, so he had a depressive episode. He had a lot of personal trauma, deaths and a divorce, and then trouble accessing his children, and just a whole bunch of life stuff just hit him all at once within a couple of years, and he had a major depressive episode and then developed severe anxiety, which came out at tax time, funnily enough. So he's doing his tax return and had this massive panic attack, and we were like, this was about 6 years ago now, and we're like, what's going on, what is this? And it was a big anxiety attack, and he just progressively got worse and worse, and very, very reluctant to go to the GP because they'd been to the GP and they put on medication, which made some of the personal issues worse. But the GP said, he said, he's also an actor, so he gets up on stage, it's fine on stage, doesn't have nerves. But the GP said, oh, well, you're still acting? And he said, yes, I'm still acting. He said, oh, well, you've just got an artistic personality. If you can get on stage, you're fine. And I was just like, like horror, chilled, just flooded you. I was thinking, we're not going to get help. Like, that was it. The GP is your gateway to getting help. And I thought cognitive behaviour therapy would help him. And we just couldn't get it. Like, it was $180, and eventually he changed GPs. A friend recommended someone who was quite, who knew about mental health. And then he got, he was severe, he was having panic attacks daily. It was severe. I'd called the community mental health team at one point. They didn't come, but anyway, it was that bad. And then, so we got the care, and within 8 weeks, 8 sessions, he was just well on the road to recovery. And even though it's taken, 4 or 5 years to get to a point where you're feeling on top of things and to get your brain out of that danger zone, that was the turning point, was the free healthcare, the free psychotherapy.
So if nothing else, it would be fantastic if we could all access that for as long as we needed it. Chloe, can you sort that out next week?
I've been trying for quite a while, and as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, that's the purpose of me now picking up the mental health portfolio, is to work diplomatically and constructively inside government, but also to work with communities to lobby quite heavily for that funding. We're actively working on it. One thing which I did want to pick up on was the story around cannabis and mental health. Because I do feel as though the debate around drugs and drug law reform and mental health often becomes quite binary. where people are saying that the reason that we want to legalise the cannabis is so that everybody can smoke cannabis. That's absolutely not the case. I come from the starting point that I think that, drugs absolutely can be harmful. But our responses to them in particular can be ever more harmful and can compound and manifest that harm. So right now, and also personally knowing a large range of young people from different demographics and backgrounds who have had bad outcomes as a result of indulging too much in cannabis, I think that had they been able to turn around to their parents and say, I need help, then outcomes for them would have been so much better. So it's actually fundamentally about restricting access, which is what you get when you regulate something, but also about ensuring that people are able to stick their hand up and ask for help, because nobody's going to do that if they risk going away in handcuffs. Yeah, so that's kind of the
And it's
intersection
also
there.
muddled up, isn't it, with the medical marijuana stuff?
Oh,
'Cause
totally.
I
I
think
think
people
that
get really
the-
muddled up around that.
Yeah,
because
I think the
that's-
entire debate is really obfuscated, and obviously that, speaking obviously, take it with a grain of salt, you're all smart enough, the kind of moral panic knee-jerk is to try and put all of that together, because if they can drum up as much of fear as possible about this issue, which has been conflated, then nobody wants to engage in the debate. But if we want to have a respectful, mature, evidence-informed, research-backed discussion, then we have to pick a way through all that complexity and nuance. And I think that just looks like maturity as a country. So I'm really hopeful about it. Unfortunately, the only person who seems to be willing to go up and fight me on this issue on the public stage is Bob McCroskey from Family First, conservative organisation, who I debated on Q&A a few weekends ago. But I do feel as though we are kind of at a tipping point where we are able to finally bring these issues out into the open, because I think everybody has finally cottoned on to the fact that this stuff already happens, and it happens in the shadows. We just have to take it out of the shadows. And again, that's the important thing to me about correlating and investigating both abuse and addiction as well as mental health issues, because often the driving factors and the environmental factors are quite similar. And speaking to prison populations as well, a huge majority of those in prison have underlying mental health issues and abuse and addiction in their background. And it's this intergenerational cycle, right, where people aren't able to access help, so then they end up doing the same thing to their children, and on it goes.
Yeah, anxiety can manifest as rage. And
Yeah, totally.
That's incredibly difficult to process. I feel like we need more education of everyone around how to deal with people who are suffering an episode.
Yeah.
But I think it's something about bringing it out of the shadows, bringing it into the light, and being able to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's what this book is so very, very good at doing. Just a couple more, and then we'll have a couple of questions, or even 3 or 4 questions. I don't know. This is Kerry Sunderland, who's here, who's... Kerry says at the end of her chapter, called Scared to Death, I have been fortunate. I am not isolated. I am part of a supportive community and have developed enduring personal relationships with others. I can step out my front door and be amongst nature. My days are filled with meaningful endeavours. These are all precursors for good mental health. Assuming this foundation for a connected and meaningful life exists, I've discovered 3 steps that help me manage anxiety. The first step is to identify and acknowledge my feelings and emotions. The second, to learn how to express them. The third and most important step seems the simplest of all, but in my experience has often been the most difficult: to shut up and focus on my breath. That's beautiful, and even though this isn't a self-help book, it's got really, really, really beautiful pieces where people those of us who have anxiety can go, that's a good idea.
Yeah, there are a lot of little bits and pieces you pick up. Breath comes up a lot, actually.
Yes,
you feel anxiety, in your breath, and it's funny how common themes have emerged all the way through it. Like, there's another one, Jess Mclaughlan wrote a piece called Sit in the Fire about her psychotherapist encouraging her to just accept what was happening, basically, and to stop trying to fight it. So it's just, kind of your basic human 101 stuff, sit with your emotions, don't try and eat or medicate or drink them away, observe what's happening, be okay with that, and then you're able to sort of get through it, and that emerges in different ways.
But there's so many distractions to doing that, isn't there? That's why I think teaching students mindfulness and about giving them permission to develop an interior life would be so helpful. And to just be quiet, to be able to be quiet, because there's so many things coming at us all the time now. It's really difficult sometimes to be quiet, actually. One more and then we'll have some questions. Yvette Walker, yeah. Our emotions don't live in the same temporal world that our bodies do. There is another entire geography within ourselves that I would argue has nothing to do with our working selves or even our consuming selves. Our internal emotional lives are complex, contradictory, irrational, and extremely powerful. The half-life of a seemingly trivial event from childhood can last decades. I believe that if we want to explore our emotional landscapes, it helps to have the guidance of a mental health professional. Yeah, so good stuff, lovely stuff. Got any comments about that?
Yeah, I'll just read a couple of her passages, which I really liked. I thought they crystallised a few ideas that are sort of floating around in the book. She says, "Was the panic not coming from me at all? The world is a constant procession of calamity, violence and injustice. How could this fail to seep into a person's nervous system? Even if you shut yourself off and don't engage, it's still there, the constant hum of humanity failing. I wondered whether a panic attack was simply the body's way of dealing with the accumulated stress of being in the world, some kind of muddle-headed release mechanism. Were my panic attacks the fault line at which my personal biography met the world's biography? If the world was perfect tomorrow, would my panic end? Probably not." And then the next passage she says, she talks about a burst appendix she had. "Why is it that I don't feel shame about my burst appendix, but I do feel shame about my panic attacks? When the body is hurt, when there's disease, a broken bone, an open wound or a burn, it isn't considered a personal failure of the individual. But depression, anxiety, mood disorders and personality disorders are more usually seen as states for which the individual who is suffering is personally responsible. And the society in which we live seems to cultivate the delusion that it holds no responsibility for such things. What if my panic attacks aren't actually a sign of personal failure or an indicator that I can't cope with life? What if they're more systemic? An indicator that the world in which we live is not an easy place to be," which I think we're all feeling at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. So any questions? Have people got questions?
And I'll just pass the mic around because we're recording.
There's been an avalanche of information coming about the importance of nutrition, especially with the way that the quality of our food has deteriorated over the last, say, 30 years. I would like, and we know that, this information coming out, which is some people don't even know about, is that so many of the hormones that we create are created in the gut. Could I have comments about nutrition and how, the speakers...
Well, we have several essays that address
Yeah, there's several...
Available just over there.
Yeah. Judy, there's several essays in the book about micronutrients and mental health with people working in that area. Really, really comprehensive, very good essays.
Just comments.
Yeah, at this point in my life, my anxiety is driven entirely by what I eat and drink. Like, it's just black and white. It's become so obvious over the last 10 years that if I have a lot of sugar and drink alcohol, I'm going to feel like terrible the next day and get that fluttering in here. But if I don't eat sugar, it disappears. I know people have a lot of, don't believe that, but for me personally, my biology seems to completely reject
Sugar.
I still
Yeah.
The scientific literature, it shows that exercise, vigorous cardiovascular exercise for 20 minutes a day, is the single most effective thing you can do to manage mood disorders. That has a larger effect size than any kind of medication or any kind of therapy you can take. And there are all sorts of theories about why that is, that maybe it reduces inflammation or it's some endogenous opioids, and there are lots of arguments about it, but that's kind of the, I mean, I really agree that materialist causes are a huge factor.
My question is mainly just for Chloe. I understand most industries have their issues with mental health, but I come from the performing arts, so that's my background, and I'm just asking if your arts portfolio and your mental health portfolio work in isolation, or do they connect in any way?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that all of my portfolios overlap. You heard the list before, there's about 10 of them. So I also hold, for example, education and local government as well as broadcasting. I think broadcasting is incredibly important with the overlap with regard to mental health in terms of how we report on it. Yeah, I mean, in terms of performing arts and education, I think that there is some really interesting new ways to particularly explore communities' understanding of how certain mental health manifests and how particularly children's behaviour, behaving badly or otherwise, and kind of teaching different teachers and principals, and have been engaging with a few different community organisations on that level. But yeah, everything overlaps. I think that on the mental health front in particular, and talking to those overlaps, I think it's about recognising that it shouldn't be siloed in, because that's often been the case. I mean, we talk about health as a whole, and previously our mental health portfolio used to sit within health because we have 8 MPs. But we've managed to and decided to carve it out because we thought that it deserved explicit focus. And you're alluding to it previously, Naomi, about the fact that, if you fall over and break your leg or somebody's choking, you call 111 and you get an ambulance immediately because that's recognised and it's physical and you can see it. But if someone's having a panic attack or a breakdown, nobody knows who to call. So there has to be this way to recognise that disparity and ability to not put physical health down at the expense of mental health, but realise that it's all interconnected. So I definitely don't see it as something that should be siloed or narrowed or just over there. Wellbeing is critical and manifests in many different ways, and different people have different outlets. Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you, very educative this afternoon. I'd like just to make one suggestion. I have one question. You mentioned insomnia, and I think we all agreed underpins most mental health issues. And our NICAO House, our mental health services here in Nelson, which is government funded and has a wonderful team of qualified staff, are holding a sleep workshop next month. It's open to all ages. I understand it's free, but it is a very active thing that anybody can go to. But my question is that youth mental health is paramount and the issues are devastating. But what is happening about issues of senior mental health? How the withdrawal of love, i.e. family, leads to loneliness and depression.
I have no answers, but I just thought that was a really useful and insightful point.
Yeah. Further to, so Johan Hari wrote Chasing the Scream, and he's recently written a book on mental health, so it's probably potentially where it's from. And he was in the country about 5 weeks ago, and I was privileged to meet him. And one of the things that he said, which really struck with me, which also speaks to the intersection of drugs and addiction and abuse and mental health, is about how, he's got this great quote about how the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. So the notion that, particularly when we're talking about drugs. I mean, we have a whole raft of legal drugs, whether it's sugar or alcohol or otherwise, that people are able to engage in and not necessarily engage in problematically. But people are less inclined to fall off the cliff in terms of engaging in abusive or addictive behaviour if they are surrounded by people and feel that love and that connection. I definitely think that amongst seniors in particular, isolation is probably the biggest concern. I mean, I find that there's an interesting parallel in terms of systemic or political responses to that potentially, in that New Zealand has one of the lowest rates of elderly poverty because of the benefit for older people in the form of the pension, and that being applied universally. If we were to look at that universalism in some kind of cultural response or otherwise around connection or community or mental health or otherwise, I think it could be quite powerful. But so too, you know, when we're speaking about mental health and that kind of connection point, I think that everybody is quite atomized in modern society, whether it is younger or older people. And what I mean by that is that if you look at, for example, the economy or, you know, the housing market, we have this gig economy at the moment which predominantly affects younger people, meaning that you don't have linear, straightforward careers anymore, so you don't necessarily know your co-workers because you're not working in the same company with them for a decade or whatever the case may be. We have the lowest rates of home ownership since the 1950s or 60s, which means that people are more inclined to be moving around a lot, so you literally don't know your neighbours, so you don't form community in the same way that you used to. So the way that I articulate it when I visit like high schools, for example, is that, you know, when you have a problem nowadays, it's not necessarily something that you have shared experience with other people to be able to talk about. So you internalise it, it's your problem and it's therefore a problem with you. And, you know, of course, with the compounding stress and strain of, you know, economic pressures or whatever, that results and culminates in mental ill health for people. But yeah, I think that the focus could absolutely be on building community and being really conscious about isolation as actually a killer in society if we're talking about loneliness.
The seniors.
I do, and I really enjoy visiting retirement villages.
Yeah, and I just want to say there's a great seniors place out at Stoke, Carolyn Budge runs, which is really, really doing a lot of good work at connecting older people up to one another. And that's, yeah.
Can I just quickly say there's some research on day clinics, Burwood Hospital in Christchurch, that has been shown to be effective in helping senior mental health. There's only one in the country, which is that one. But I've got a story in the Listener about it next week. So, yeah, if you want to learn more, then
Get the Listener.
or the week after. I can't remember actually. Yeah.
Okay. One more question.
This relates to age. I'm in my mid-80s, and I used to have this, as you call it, tape that runs in your head. Couldn't I have done that better and all that? And you mentioned that, you know, you had enough people, women in their 30s. Okay, so my experience is that each decade I've lived has certain advantages and disadvantages. And just so long as you're reasonably healthy, the nice thing about being in the 70s and 80s is that tape gets turned off, at least for me. So I wonder if in your book, Naomi, you have people of, you know, all ages, and whether that's generally true, in which case it's a very hopeful thing to get older.
Yeah.
Because I'm constantly, you know, there's constantly to be youthful is to be wonderful. That is not my experience.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot from a lot of amazing, mostly women really. They say that. I think maybe for women the tape is louder. But we have from 20, I think our oldest is probably 50s. I did, which is totally the wrong answer. I did specifically want. I'm just looking through them now. I remember specifically saying we need senior people, but I don't think we actually managed to get any.
That again is something that comes up a lot in the literature, which is that your happiness is a U-shaped curve throughout life, and your 40s is the real nadir, and then it starts getting better. So you've got a lot to look forward to. Yeah.
Yeah, actually we do have one by a physiotherapist, and she talks about holding anxiety in the body, and she's a bit older than 30. Yeah.
Good question.
But yeah, great point.
Yeah, good question.
I reckon that probably points out quite a poignant point, which is that if we were able to have greater conversations and communities amongst younger and older people, then that would go some way to alleviating particularly elderly isolation, but also helping younger people feel as though this isn't, again, isolation, a form of isolation in terms of that experience, and somebody speaking to their own life experience would be quite beneficial.
So, Headlands is a significant book. It teaches us how 30 diverse, intelligent, courageous people grapple with anxiety, how they make sense of it and manage it on a daily basis. Please buy it and be kind and compassionate to all the people with anxiety that you encounter. You three rock. I'm very grateful to you all. Can you all just express your appreciation?